Under the gray sky of a city overflowing with technology and electronic noise, Mr. James sat silently on the express train, leaving behind the Biological Research Center where he had devoted 25 years of his life. He had once been the pride of the scientific community, the man behind groundbreaking advancements in artificial pollination, genetically programmed plants, and simulated ecosystems. But when everything became perfect, he suddenly felt lost. His achievements now lay across fields lit 24/7, where every flower bloomed on a preset schedule, their fragrance fine-tuned by algorithms, and bees were nothing more than buzzing robots. Every morning he entered the laboratory without a flicker of anticipation. Each time a pollen compound was successfully synthesized, there was no more joy. He often stood before the glass chamber where artificial pollination was performed, staring at the tiny grains being inserted into test tubes. And one question repeated endlessly in his mind, like a background hum that couldn't be turned off. Are we still truly touching nature? Perhaps that was why, on a drizzly afternoon, he closed his folders, returned his access card, and walked out of the gate of the International Institute of Biology without a word of farewell. He didn't tell anyone where he was going, but his steps had already chosen the path, returning to the countryside where his mother once lived, the place where the last memories of a real world still lingered. It was the place where, as a child, he had run through the wildflower garden his mother had planted at the forest's edge, where bees came each morning without programming, where each flower had its own scent knot crafted by a computer, and he hoped that somewhere in that place, a little piece of the natural world still remained, so he could remember something real. Not science, not technology, but life. In the fading light of late afternoon, Mr. James walked slowly through the old Gardena place that had once been his mother's personal world. Grass had overrun most of the path, tangled shrubs pressed into one another, but somewhere amid the wilted leaves and cracked earth, a few wildflowers still persisted. Tiny purple daisies, pale butterfly bushes, and a lavender patch peeking from the shadows. They weren't radiant, nor carefully pruned, yet they carried a quiet beauty of defiance, if whispering, "We are still here." Memory swept over him like wind through the trees. He thought of his mother, a small woman, yet always filled with light. She used to spend entire afternoons just sitting among the flowers, speaking gentle words to them as if they were dear friends. "You know," she once smiled, "wildflowers don't need to be controlled. They only need to be listened to." Young James had nodded back then, brushing it off as the dreamy talk of someone unaccustomed to machines. But now, in a world drowning in data and starved of feeling, those words came back to him clearer than ever. Standing in the garden that seemed long forgotten, James quietly opened the old wooden chest inside the house where his mother had stored her most treasured things. There, beneath a time-worn embroidered cloth, was the dusty electric field meter she had once given him back in his student years. He had dismissed it back then as a sentimental keepsake, nostalgic, not scientific. But today, his hands trembled slightly as he powered it on. The screen flickered. Weak, oscillating lines began to appear as he brought the device closer to the flowers. And then, just a few inches from the petals, the meter gently buzzed as if it had picked up on something the world had long forgotten. Mr. James looked down at the tiny wild blooms, and for the first time in his life, he didn't try to analyze or program anything. He simply listened. One early morning, while dew still clung to the blades of grass, Mr. James quietly returned to the garden, carrying the old electric field meter. The screen was faded, its casing worn with age, but inside, like the wildflowers themselves, it still seemed to hold a spark of life. He knelt beside a small cluster of lavender, their pale purple petals swaying gently in the breeze. Bringing the sensor close, he watched the screen with quiet focus. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Silence? Then, the signal light blinked. A soft, steady oscillation appeared. The numbers began to shift lightly on the screen. Static electricity. He held his breath. Not from the device, not from background interference, but from the petals themselves. He repeated the test with other blooms in the garden: wild daisies, dandelions, shy hibiscus flowers nestled against the stone wall. The results were the same. Each one still emitted faint traces of electric charge, delicate but constant, invisible letters drifting out into the air. His heart tightened. After all these years, without tending, without fertilizer, without programming, and with no bees left to visit the flowers, had never stopped sending their signals. As if they were continuing a conversation no one else remembered, a quiet invitation, expecting no reply. He recalled an old scientific study. Flowers use electrical fields to whisper, to be signaling they still have nectar, that they're still alive, still in need of pollination. And bees, with their ultra-sensitive hairs, could feel that subtle hum like a sweet summons from life itself. Mr. James stood in silence for a long moment. It felt as though he had just read an ancient letter written without ink or words, yet full of longing. A message from nature, enduring and faithful. Even forgotten, the flowers still called out. Not because someone might hear, but because it was instinct and unconditional love for life. And in that moment, something within him began to change. Since the day he discovered the invisible letters in the electric charges of flowers, Mr. James was no longer the same man. The scientist who once lived, sealed inside laboratories, who used formulas and sensors to program bloom cycles, now sat for hours in stillness among wild grasses and blooming weeds. No modern instruments. No flickering monitors. Only the wind threading its way through the leaves, birdsong in the distance, and the rustling of flowers brushing against one another like secret whispers. He began to experience nature in an entirely new way, not as a subject of study, but as a living being, telling stories. Every morning, he would carry a cup of tea to sit beside the lavender bush, watching the light scatter across each petal and listen, not with his ears but with his heart. When the field meter picked up a vibration, he no longer saw it as data. It was a sentence, a signal, something deeply real, deeply alive. I'm still here. I'm still breathing, still waiting to be heard. Gradually, real bees began to return. At first one, then another. Tiny wings hovered and swirled gently between the old, unkempt flowers. He sat still, unmoving, watching with profound reverence. Each time a bee paused near a flower emitting a charge, it felt like witnessing a dialogue, flowers sending an invitation, bees quietly replying. No language needed. No data sets. No circuit boards or transmission lines. Just life, speaking to life. And in that silence, Mr. James felt as if he were relearning what it meant to be human, not through a computer screen, but through the curve of a petal, the shimmer of a dewdrop, and the softest hum in the world. The first pages of Mr. James' new journal began with a single, simple line. Perhaps flowers don't need to be controlled. Perhaps they just need someone to pause and listen. He wrote those words after spending a morning seated for hours beside a patch of wild daisies, when his old field meter recorded a series of gentle, steady vibrations, clear evidence that the flowers were emitting signals for bees. No guidance, no programming. The flowers knew when it was time to speak. And he, a scientist who once believed that life must be controlled in order to survive, was beginning to learn how to let go. Every morning, he rose early, while dew still clung to the leaves. With his notebook in hand and the field meter slung gently over his shoulder, he stepped into the garden his mother once tended. There were no sprinklers, no growth stimulants, no bags of chemical fertilizer touching that earth anymore. Instead, he picked up fallen branches, trimmed away wild weeds, and cleared narrow furrows in the soil so that dew could seep into the roots. Each time he recorded a new electric fluctuation. He didn't just note the time, the flower, and the strength, added a line of feeling, as if journaling the inner landscape of his own spirit. The lavender signaled earlier today than yesterday, maybe because there were more bees yesterday. I no longer feel alone when I sit among the flowers. The more he wrote, the more connected he felt not just to nature, but to the human part of himself he had lost in a world overly programmed and precise. With every hand-poured drop of water, every flower left untouched instead of trimmed, and every breeze allowed to pass freely without being blocked by glass, the garden began to bloom again. And in that quiet blooming, Mr. James too was blossoming once more like a late-season flower that had found a reason to bloom one more time. One early autumn morning, as golden sunlight draped gently across dew-soaked leaves, Mr. James stepped into the garden as he did every day field meter in one hand, a dirt-stained notebook in the other. But something felt different today, a sound, familiar yet strange. It wasn't the buzz of the field meter, nor the rustling of wind. It was a soft humming gentle, like an old melody being quietly sung again. He looked up. On a low branch near the edge of the garden, a small beehive shimmered under the morning lightning, tucked behind a few thin leaves. His eyes lit up with a wonder he could not hide. After so many years in laboratories, where he had simulated bees hundreds of times, he had never seen a real beehive return so close to where humans still lived. Word spread quickly along the dusty village paths. Children who usually spent their days inside, glued to games, began to peek curiously through the garden gate, eyes wide with astonishment as real bees hovered around real flowers. To them, flowers were textbook illustrations and bees mere plastic models from classroom experiments. But here, everything was alive, vibrant, and real in ways they had never imagined. Mr. James smiled and beckoned them closer. Under the shade of a wild apple tree, he began the most extraordinary lesson of his life. There was no whiteboard, no slide presentations, only flowers, bees, an old field meter, and a room full of raw, childlike curiosity. "Put your ear close to this flower," he whispered. "Can you hear it? The flower is writing a letter." The children leaned in. A little girl gasped when the field meter gave a faint buzz. "There's a bee coming!" And so it went that taught them how to observe flowers with their hearts, how to listen to life with reverence. It was more than knowledge. It was connection. In their shimmering eyes, he saw something more miraculous than technology, a deepening belief that the natural world was still speaking to Yusuf, only we remembered how to listen. Beneath the shade of the old tree at the edge of the garden, Mr. James opened his tablet and typed the first lines into a prominent biology forum. "I no longer chase awards. I just want to ask, have we controlled life so tightly that we've ended up killing it?" There were no complex charts. Number 3, D models. Just a few photos off a single wildflower, a field meter blinking softly beside it, and a few bees hovering silently, as if reading the unspoken letters written by nature itself. The post didn't take long to spread, but what James didn't expect was that young scientists began arriving at the garden not to debate, but to listen. They brought microscopes, ultra-high-definition lenses, even drones, yet after only a few hours, what held them there wasn't data. It was a feeling one they hadn't encountered for a long time in their laboratories, the sensation of real breathing life. A young botany student broke into tears as she smelled lavender for the first time in it, synthesized by a corporation, but blooming freely under the sun. A geneticist, once the lead of a synthetic plant project, now sat silently recording electric signals from a wild daisy as if decoding a letter written in an ancient tongue. Mr. James didn't lecture them. He didn't lead them through any syllabus. He simply invited them to sit beneath the trees, alongside the children, the bees, the flower stove, feel that science could be an extension of life's wisdom, not a noose around nature's neck. As the hum of bees echoed beneath the thin blue sky, James knew he was no longer alone in this journey. A new generation was waking up, and the once forgotten garden had become the first listening station for life where science bowed to nature, not to dominate, but to understand and to protect. Beneath the soft silk of the early morning light, Mr. James sat on the porch of his old wooden house, a thick, time-worn notebook in hand, its pages faded to a gentle ivory brown. There were no more lines of code, no tangled charts, just simple, handwritten notes, recording the static charge each wildflower emitted every morning. On today's page, he wrote, "Dandelion, faintest signal, yet the bees still come. Perhaps it is the softest whisper that is truly heard." He no longer used a laptop to store data, because he understood now nature doesn't need to be stored. It needs to be felt. Each morning brought a new discovery, a new flower, a new signal. Sometimes it was a violet myrtle blooming quietly near the fence. Sometimes it was a cluster of tiny white blossoms along the footpath. They didn't bloom in bold colors like the engineered plants of the cities. But each of them, no matter how small, still sent out their electric letter, released into the air, letting the bees know, "I'm still here." No one had taught the flowers how to do that. They simply never stopped speaking. And to remind himself never to forget, Mr. James had written a single, short line carefully penned and pinned to the wooden door of his porch, where anyone passing by could read it. Nature never stops speaking. The question is, have you paused long enough to listen? On still, windless afternoons, he would sit beneath the tree's shade, eyes following the bees as they danced from flower to flower, not to count them, not to measure pollination rates, but simply to witness a miracle repeating itself. That when we listen to nature with our whole heart, it always answers, with a bloom, a breeze, or the soft return of a bee's wings. And that unspoken letter, it's still being sent every single day. If this story touched your heart, please like the video to give strength to the messages of nature. Share it to spread this unspoken letter to many more, to those who may have forgotten that nature is still whispering every single day. And subscribe to our channel to continue this journey of listening to the earth, where every story is a seed of hope. If you've ever felt small in this vast world, remember, even a single small action can create something truly extraordinary. Hime.